Jesus does not appear in a single eyewitness record from his own lifetime, and that alone should make every believer stop in their tracks. Because if Jesus of Nazareth truly performed miracles, if he really raised the dead and walked on water and shook the Roman Empire, why did no one at the time think to write it down? This is not a minor footnote. This is the first and most devastating crack in the foundation of the entire Christian story. Because the silence of history is not a silence of mystery, it is a silence that screams. Let that sink in. No Roman officials, no Greek philosophers, no Jewish scholars recorded a word about Jesus while he was allegedly alive. The figure we know as Jesus only begins to appear decades later in anonymous texts written by unknown authors who never met him, heard him, or even lived in the same towns he supposedly visited. The Gospels do not come from the time of Jesus, they come from the time of myth-making. And here is the part the church does not want you to know. This silence was not an accident. It was protected, guarded, preserved under the weight of faith and fear. Because if we admit that the historical record is empty, we are forced to ask the question most have been too afraid to consider. Did Jesus exist at all? Think about the time he allegedly lived in, the Roman Empire, obsessed with records, bureaucracy, and control. From population counts to tax rolls, from prisoner logs to trial transcripts, Rome documented everything. And yet, for Jesus, the man supposedly at the center of the most influential religion in human history, there is nothing. Not one Roman historian, governor, or philosopher wrote about him during his lifetime. Not one. Would a man who stirred up crowds, challenged the Pharisees, and was executed under Roman law have gone completely unnoticed? It is not just unlikely, it is impossible. Then there is Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who lived during the exact same time Jesus allegedly did, walked the same lands, and wrote volumes about Judaism, messianic movements, and religious tension in the region. Yet he never once mentions Jesus, not a word. He even traveled to Jerusalem during the supposed life of Christ. Are we to believe he somehow missed the Son of God? These are not fringe theories. These are documented silences in history. The names we are told support the historical Jesus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, all wrote decades later and often based on hearsay or manipulated texts. None are contemporary. None are eyewitnesses. And when you look closer, even those accounts are suspiciously brief, vague, or openly contested by scholars for being altered by early Christian editors desperate to root their Savior in history. So ask yourself, if someone you knew performed miracles, healed the sick, and defied death, would that not be the most unforgettable, life-altering story you could ever tell? Would you not write it down? Paint it on walls? Carve it in stone? Yet from the time Jesus supposedly lived, we have nothing. No letters, no mentions, no drawings, no coins, no graffiti. Nothing. Why? Because the story did not happen then. It happened later, when it was safe to build a legend from silence. The church built an empire on this silence, not despite it, but because of it. Because a myth born in the dark cannot be challenged by the light of evidence. And this brings us to the first irrefutable proof. The total absence of contemporary historical evidence is not just suspicious, it is damning. If Jesus had existed as described, the records would be undeniable. But they are not. They are missing. And that is the beginning of a truth far more unsettling than most believers are prepared to face. Because once you realize the silence was intentional, you cannot unhear it. You begin to understand that faith may not be a light in the dark, but a way to avoid asking what the darkness is hiding. And we are just getting started. Proof 2 will shake the Gospels themselves and show why the very texts used to prove Jesus might actually prove the opposite. If the story of Jesus had any foundation in historical fact, the Gospels would agree. But they do not even close, and this is not some scholarly nitpick or theological side debate. This is a central, undeniable truth that the Church has worked tirelessly to obscure. Because once you begin to actually read the Gospels side by side, the contradictions leap out like red flags waving in the face of blind faith. And suddenly, the words you thought were divine become evidence of something far more human and far more flawed. They show that the Gospels are not historical documents. They are theological propaganda written decades after the events they claim to describe, by anonymous authors in different languages, from different places, with different agendas, and most importantly, not one of them ever met Jesus in person. And that single fact changes everything, because it means the Jesus they describe is not the man who walked in Galilee, but the invention of belief, the echo of stories passed down, exaggerated, revised, and weaponized to serve growing religious movements desperate for structure, for power, for control. And when you compare the Gospels, it becomes clear just how unstable that foundation is. Take the resurrection, supposedly the cornerstone of Christianity, the moment that defines the faith itself. And yet, every Gospel gives a different account. In Matthew, there is a violent earthquake and one angel. In Mark, there is no earthquake, and the women flee in fear and say nothing to anyone. In Luke, the women report the resurrection, and 2 men appear instead of angels. And in John, Mary Magdalene finds the tomb alone, then returns with the disciples, and later sees Jesus outside the tomb. These are not subtle differences. These are mutually exclusive versions of the most important event in Christian theology. And yet Christians are taught to read them as if they form one coherent story, stitched together in sermons and Sunday school lessons to hide the obvious fact that they do not align. And it does not end there. The contradictions are everywhere. Was Jesus born in Bethlehem because of a census, as Luke says, or was he already from Bethlehem, as Matthew implies? Did Herod order the slaughter of infants, as Matthew claims, or did that never happen, as Luke and all secular history suggest? Did Jesus cleanse the temple at the beginning of his ministry, as John says, or at the end, as the Synoptic Gospels report? These are not mistakes made by scribes or typos in ancient manuscripts. They are evidence that the authors of these texts were not eyewitnesses, but rather writers separated from the events by time, distance, and ideology. And worse, they were writing to different communities with different needs, which means they were not simply reporting what happened. They were crafting stories to support specific theological claims, stories that sometimes required altering timelines, geography, even the words of Jesus himself. And the Church knows this, biblical scholars know this, seminary professors know this, but most people in the pews do not, because they are told to read the Bible with faith, not with scrutiny. And yet, what kind of truth falls apart under scrutiny? Why would a divine message need 4 conflicting accounts written decades apart by anonymous writers, none of whom ever quote Jesus directly, because no one was writing down his words at the time? Think about that. The supposed Son of God speaks to multitudes, performs miracles, delivers sermons that define Western morality for centuries. And yet, not a single person wrote down what he said while he was alive. And what we have instead are redacted recollections, each filtered through second-hand hearsay, oral traditions, political motivations, and cultural lenses that reshape Jesus into whatever the author's community needed. To Matthew, he is the Jewish Messiah, fulfilling every prophecy. To Mark, the suffering servant. To Luke, the universal Savior. To John, the divine Word made flesh. And none of these depictions are consistent with each other, because they are not describing the same man. They are describing an idea, a legend, a theological construct. And if you still doubt that, ask yourself this: why do we not even know who wrote the Gospels? The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added later. The original manuscripts were anonymous, and the early church fathers debated their authorship for centuries, because even they knew these texts were not penned by the apostles themselves. And if that is true, then what does it mean that billions of people base their lives on books we cannot even reliably attribute?
This is not a faith built on firm ground. It is a house of cards stacked by generations of believers who never dared to look too closely. And that is why the contradictions in the Gospels matter so much, because they show us that the story of Jesus was never about accuracy. It was about persuasion, control, and belief. And if the story needs to change depending on the audience, then how can it be called the truth? This is the second irrefutable proof. The gospel contradictions are not literary flourishes or poetic metaphors. They are signs that the Jesus we read about was constructed, not remembered, designed to unify a growing movement, not to report real events. And once you see this, you cannot unsee it, because it means that the Bible does not preserve the life of a man. It preserves the evolution of a myth. And the next proof shows that this myth existed long before Jesus ever supposedly walked the earth.
If Jesus was real, if his life was the one and only divine story of salvation, why does it match so many stories that came centuries before him? And I am not talking about vague similarities or metaphorical connections. I am talking about specific, undeniable parallels that have existed since long before Jesus was ever born. And the church knows this. They know it deep in their archives, in their ancient texts, in the records they no longer teach or translate, because the truth is too dangerous, too obvious, too unraveling. And once you see the pattern, you cannot go back. Because the life story of Jesus, the virgin birth, the miracles, the 12 followers, the death, and the resurrection, it is not unique. It is recycled, repurposed, and retold through the lens of older myths, older gods. And that is the third irrefutable proof that Jesus' story is not history. It is mythological mimicry dressed in new robes. Take Horus, the Egyptian god born of a virgin named Isis, whose birth was heralded by a star in the east, who was adored by 3 kings, who began his ministry at age 12, who was baptized, tempted in the wilderness, performed miracles, raised the dead, was crucified and resurrected, centuries before Jesus. Then look at Mithras, the Persian god, born on December 25th, celebrated by shepherds, whose followers celebrated a communal meal resembling communion, who was called the Son of God and the light of the world. Then there is Attis of Phrygia, who died and resurrected after 3 days. Dionysus, who turned water into wine and was also born of a divine mother. Krishna of India, born of a virgin, with a wicked king trying to kill him at birth, surrounded by miraculous signs. All of these saviors share motifs that mirror the Jesus narrative. And no, this is not a coincidence, this is not accidental, and it is not a case of different cultures arriving at the same story. This is what happens when a religion forms not from reality, but from selective borrowing, symbolic stitching, and the deliberate adaptation of older myths to fit a new theological purpose. And when you realize that early Christians lived in a melting pot of pagan religions, especially in places like Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome, places saturated with mystery cults and mythological traditions, it becomes obvious that Christianity did not appear in a vacuum. It absorbed, it blended, it rebranded. And that is how myths survive. They evolve, they wear new names, and the church called this one Jesus. And if that sounds like a conspiracy, remember that early Christian writers like Justin Martyr openly admitted these similarities and tried to explain them away by claiming that Satan created the pagan myths in advance to mislead people. Let that sink in. They did not deny the parallels. They acknowledged them and said the devil did it first. Is that the response of a faith built on truth, or a desperate attempt to preserve belief in the face of obvious evidence that the story of Jesus had been told long before Jesus ever allegedly lived? And this matters, because if the story is not unique, it cannot be divine. And if it is built from the bones of old myths, it is not revelation, it is repetition. And the church has spent centuries silencing this knowledge, destroying texts, banning scholars, rewriting history. And yet the parallels endure.
They are inscribed in temples, painted on ancient walls, written in surviving scrolls, and known to anyone willing to read beyond the confines of church-approved doctrine. So ask yourself, how did the story of Jesus become so perfectly aligned with these older myths, unless it was crafted that way? Why would a real historical man's life mirror symbolic stories passed down from other cultures? Why does the most divine man in history seem to follow a script already written by human hands centuries earlier? Because he was shaped by those stories, molded by them, created in their image. And that is not the profile of a unique savior. That is the pattern of a myth manufactured to feel familiar, to feel comforting, to feel inevitable. And that is how religions gain power, not by creating something new, but by echoing what people already believe, reinforcing what they already trust, and blending it with authority, ritual, and fear. And if you are still unsure, ask why December 25th, the birthday of Jesus, was never mentioned in the Bible, and yet perfectly matches the pagan solstice festivals. Or why Easter, the celebration of the resurrection, aligns with ancient fertility rites and the cycle of spring renewal. It is because the church built Jesus on a foundation that had already existed, a scaffolding of ancient myth and ritual that was too powerful, too familiar, too emotionally effective to abandon. And once that structure was in place, it was sealed with divine language, made sacred by repetition, and protected with blood and fire. And this is the third irrefutable proof. Jesus' story is not original. It is constructed from the stories that came before. And if the foundation is a myth, then what does that make the figure built on top of it? And if the church knows this, if they have hidden it, denied it, destroyed the evidence, then what else are they hiding? The next proof reveals the shocking truth about the most influential Christian of all time, and the one man who never met Jesus, yet shaped the entire religion around him.
What if I told you that the most important figure in Christianity never met Jesus, never heard him speak, never saw him heal anyone, never witnessed a single miracle, and yet he is the one who built the Jesus that billions believe in today? And that is not an exaggeration, that is a historical fact, and his name is Paul, the man who wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else, the man who established churches across the Roman world, the man whose letters define Christian doctrine even today. And yet the Jesus he describes is not a teacher, not a carpenter, not a man who walked dusty roads and preached to crowds. He is a cosmic being, a spiritual figure, a divine entity revealed through visions, not memory. And that is the fourth irrefutable proof that Jesus never existed, because the Jesus of Paul is not a person from history. He is a voice in Paul's head, a revelation that appeared suddenly, mysteriously, long after the supposed crucifixion. And Paul says this clearly. He received his gospel not from men, not from the apostles, not from witnesses, but from a direct revelation. And that changes everything, because if the earliest Christian writings are not about a real man who lived and died, but about a mystical being encountered in ecstatic visions, then Christianity was never built on history. It was built on personal belief, on private spiritual experiences, on psychological moments that cannot be verified. And what makes it worse is that Paul never mentions almost anything we associate with the life of Jesus. No virgin birth, no Bethlehem, no parables, no miracles, no Sermon on the Mount, no calming the sea, no walking on water, no feeding 5,000. Nothing. And that is not a coincidence. It is a glaring omission. Because if Paul had known any of those details, if he believed in the earthly Jesus described in the Gospels, he would have written about them. But he does not, and instead he writes about sin, salvation, blood, crucifixion, and resurrection. But even that resurrection is vague, described as a spiritual transformation, a divine mystery, not a literal man stepping out of a tomb. And what makes this even more shocking is that Paul's letters are the earliest Christian documents we have, written decades before the Gospels. And they paint a picture of a Jesus who is not a man remembered, but a figure imagined, worshipped, experienced through inner conviction. And when Paul does mention other apostles who supposedly knew Jesus, he disagrees with them, challenges them, even claims superior knowledge because of his own visions. And think about what that means. The man who never met Jesus in life is claiming to know more than the men who walked with him. And those men, like Peter and James, barely appear in Paul's writings, except as obstacles to his version of the truth. And if you remove Paul from the New Testament, what is left? A scattered set of narratives written after Paul's death, trying to harmonize a growing religion around stories that Paul never mentioned. And here is the brutal irony. Christians today follow Paul's Jesus, not the Jesus of history, not the Jesus of Galilee, but the mystical Christ of Paul's letters, a spiritual savior invented after the fact, crafted in language borrowed from Hellenistic mystery cults, using symbols of death and rebirth already common in the ancient world. And the church knows this, scholars know this, but believers are rarely told. Because if you realize that the man who shaped Christianity never knew Jesus, then the entire foundation collapses. Because it means that Christianity is not a continuation of the life of Jesus. It is a replacement of it, an erasure of the historical in favor of the theological. And ask yourself this: why would the earliest writer about Jesus know less about his life than the later gospel writers? Why would Paul omit every detail we consider essential? The answer is simple and devastating. Because those details did not exist yet. They were not part of the belief. They were added later. And Paul never knew them because they had not been invented. And that is why Paul's Jesus is not a man from Nazareth. He is a cosmic symbol, a theological construct used to unify diverse communities across the empire. And that is the fourth irrefutable proof, that the man most responsible for the spread of Christianity did not believe in a historical Jesus. He believed in a divine Christ, and that belief did not come from memory. It came from a vision, a subjective experience that became doctrine. And if the core of Christianity began not with eyewitnesses, but with revelation, then it was never about facts. It was always about faith. And faith, when built on fiction, becomes something far more dangerous, something manipulable, something that can be shaped, rewritten, and abused. And that is exactly what happened next, because the fifth proof reveals how the church edited, forged, and manipulated the very texts it claims are sacred.
What if the very texts used to prove Jesus existed were not just flawed, not just exaggerated, but actively forged, altered, inserted, rewritten by the very people who claimed to guard the truth? And what if the most famous historical references to Jesus outside the Bible were fabrications, deliberate manipulations by early church leaders who knew they had to create evidence or lose control of the narrative forever? Because once you understand that, once you realize that the sacred documents were tampered with, the illusion begins to collapse, and the curtain gets pulled back on centuries of deception. And that brings us to the fifth irrefutable proof that Jesus never existed, the overwhelming evidence of textual fraud, beginning with the so-called historical proof most people cling to without ever reading for themselves. The passage in the writings of the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, often called the Testimonium Flavianum, where he allegedly says Jesus was the Christ and performed miracles. But what your pastor will never tell you, and what the church will never highlight, is that this section was not in the original manuscript. It was added later, almost certainly by Christian scribes, because the earliest copies of Josephus's work do not include it, and even early church fathers never mention it when they would have had every reason to do so. And modern scholars, not just skeptics, but Christian scholars too, widely agree that the passage was tampered with, changed to make it look like Jesus was recognized by a respected historian when he was not. And if the truth of Jesus was real, why would it need to be forged? Why would anyone have to invent supporting documents unless the original story was falling apart?
And that was not the only forgery. There are dozens of known forgeries in early Christian writings, entire books falsely attributed to apostles, letters inserted into canon long after the deaths of the supposed authors. And even within the Bible itself, there are verses added later by scribes to support doctrines that did not exist in early Christianity, such as the famous story of the woman caught in adultery. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone, which does not appear in the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of John and was clearly inserted centuries later. Not to mention the ending of the Gospel of Mark, where the resurrection appearances are tacked on after the original abrupt ending. And even the Trinity itself, one of the core doctrines of modern Christianity, relies on verses that were retroactively edited or translated to support a theology that did not exist in the earliest church. And if that is not enough to make you pause, consider that the church actively suppressed alternative gospels, writings like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, which tell radically different versions of Jesus' life and message. And these were not fringe texts. They were read by early Christians, debated by church fathers, and ultimately labeled heretical and destroyed, hidden away in deserts and caves. And why? Because they presented a Jesus that did not fit the official narrative, a Jesus who was not divine, not sacrificed, not resurrected, but human, metaphorical, symbolic, or even irrelevant to salvation. And the church made a choice: unify under one version or collapse into theological chaos. And so they chose control, and that control required censorship, forgery, and manipulation. And do not make the mistake of thinking this was some ancient misunderstanding. It was organized, it was intentional, it was political. Because the Roman Empire knew that religion was power, and they needed a version of Jesus that supported obedience, hierarchy, and eternal judgment, not one that questioned authority or offered individual spiritual freedom. And so the forgeries served an empire, not the truth. And if you still believe the Bible is the unaltered Word of God, ask yourself, why do we have thousands of manuscripts with thousands of contradictions? Why do modern Bibles include footnotes admitting that certain verses are not in the earliest texts? Why does the church continue to teach stories they know were added later? Because the myth must be maintained at all costs, even if it means lying. Because the alternative, admitting that Jesus might never have existed, is too dangerous, too disruptive, too powerful. And this is the fifth irrefutable proof. The church has not preserved the truth, it has created it, edited it, and sold it to billions as sacred, when in reality it is the product of political necessity, mythological recycling, and centuries of rewriting history. And if this already shook you, imagine what comes next. Because the final proof shows that Jesus was not just borrowed or embellished, he may have been invented entirely as a tool of imperial propaganda. And if that is true, then everything we were taught collapses into a stunning lie.
If this truth already shook you, imagine what comes next. Subscribe so you do not miss the full truth. If Jesus was real, if he truly lived, preached, died, and rose again as the Son of God, then why does his story line up so perfectly with the political needs of the Roman Empire at the exact moment they needed a new weapon to maintain control, not through force, but through faith, not by conquering with armies, but by conquering minds? Because here is the sixth and most devastating proof that Jesus never existed. He was not just a myth, he was a strategy. A calculated invention designed to pacify populations, rewrite resistance, and turn spiritual rebellion into obedient submission. And this is not guesswork. This is not a fringe theory. This is what the timeline shows, what the documents reveal, and what the church will never admit, because it destroys the very purpose of organized religion as we know it. And to understand this, you have to look at what was happening in the Roman Empire in the decades after Jesus supposedly died. The empire was crumbling under the weight of rebellions, uprisings, and the unrelenting chaos of occupied territories, especially in Judea, where Jewish zealots were rising up, demanding freedom from Rome.
and the tension was building to explosive levels. And what better way to disarm a revolution than to invent a Messiah who says to turn the other cheek, to love your enemy, to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and accept suffering as divine will. A Messiah who teaches that the real kingdom is not here on earth, but in a distant heaven after death, a place only reachable through obedience, humility, and submission. And suddenly the revolution dies, not through violence, but through transformation, because now the oppressed believe their pain is sacred, their chains are holy, and the emperor becomes not the enemy, but the one enforcing God's plan. And this is exactly what happened, because the version of Jesus that survives today is not the revolutionary, anti-establishment, prophetic Jesus of earlier texts. He is the softened, sanitized, Roman-approved Jesus created under Constantine, when Christianity was officially absorbed into the empire and molded into a tool of power. And make no mistake, Constantine did not convert to Christianity out of spiritual awakening. He converted because he saw its potential, its reach, its ability to unite a fractured empire under one religion, one authority, one narrative. And at the Council of Nicaea, the Church did what empires always do. It edited the story, erased the contradictions, banned the dangerous texts, and declared which version of Jesus would be official. Not the Jesus of history, but the Jesus of power. And once that version was codified, all other versions were hunted down, their followers executed, their writings destroyed, their ideas buried. And from that moment forward, Jesus became the property of empire, the image of obedience, the face of submission. And that is the final crushing truth. The Jesus we know today is not a man who walked the earth. He is a manufactured figure built to serve political needs, to quiet dissent, to convert rebels into servants. And when you peel back the layers, when you strip away the legends, the contradictions, the pagan borrowings, and the forgeries, what you are left with is not a man, not a Messiah, but a myth. A story written by men, edited by power, and sustained by fear. And the implications of that are staggering, because it means that billions have been taught to worship a lie, to shape their lives, their morals, their identities around a character who never lived, whose words were never spoken, whose miracles never happened, and whose resurrection was never seen. Because there was no Jesus to resurrect, no tomb to roll away, no cross to climb. Only a myth that grew in the shadows of empire until it became unchallengeable. Sacred not because it was true, but because it was useful. And when you understand that, when you see the machinery behind the myth, you start to question everything. Not just about Jesus, but about the systems that taught you to believe without question, to obey without evidence, and to fear what lies beyond the edge of faith. And that is the sixth irrefutable proof that Jesus was created not by witnesses, but by rulers, not by truth seekers, but by empire builders. And the Church knows this. It has always known this. And that is why it fights so hard to bury these facts, to silence critics, to mock questions, and to keep you believing. Because the moment you stop, the illusion collapses. And what remains is not the comfort of salvation, but the power of freedom. Freedom from fear, freedom from lies, freedom from a story that never belonged to you, but was forced upon you for the sake of control. And now that you know, you have a choice. Continue the illusion or break it. Believe the story or seek the truth. And if you choose to seek, then you are not alone.